I'm Rachel Thompson, 28 years old, and I was standing in the back of St. Michael's Cathedral in downtown Chicago, watching my own father's funeral like an outsider looking in. But that's exactly what I was. An outsider in my own family, the black sheep who'd been written off years ago. What they didn't know was that today would be the day everything changed, and the family that had spent decades mocking me was about to learn the most expensive lesson of their lives. The cathedral was packed with Chicago's elite, politicians, business leaders, society wives dripping in diamonds. My father, Richard Thompson, had been one of the most powerful real estate developers in the Midwest, and apparently everyone who mattered wanted to pay their respects. Everyone except the daughter who'd been estranged from him for the past 5 years. I'd driven 12 hours from my tiny apartment in Nashville, wearing the only black dress I owned, a simple off-the-rack number from Target that probably cost less than what my stepmother spent on her weekly manicure. My beat-up Honda Civic looked ridiculous parked between the Mercedes and BMWs in the cathedral parking lot, but I didn't care. I was here for one reason: to say goodbye to the man who'd been both my hero and my greatest disappointment. If you're watching this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button because what happened when that will was read will absolutely shock you. The front 3 pews were reserved for family, and as I looked at them, I felt the familiar sting of not belonging. There was Victoria, my stepmother, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She was playing the grieving widow perfectly, despite the fact that everyone knew she'd married my father for his money when I was 16. Next to her sat my half-brother Marcus, 25 years old, and everything my father had wanted in a son. Harvard MBA, working at Thompson Development Corporation, already being groomed to take over the family empire. He looked bored, checking his Rolex every few minutes like he had somewhere more important to be. Then there was my half-sister Sophia, 23 and fresh out of Northwestern with a communications degree she'd never use, because Daddy's money meant she'd never have to work a day in her life. She was scrolling through her phone, probably posting Instagram stories about how devastated she was, while wearing enough designer clothing to feed a family for months. And scattered throughout those front pews were aunts, uncles, and cousins, who'd all benefited from my father's success while treating me like I didn't exist. The Thompson family fortune had made them all wealthy, comfortable, secure, everyone except me. I'd chosen to stand in the back deliberately. Not because I wasn't allowed in the family section. Technically, I was still Richard Thompson's eldest daughter, but because I knew what would happen if I tried to sit with them. The whispers, the dirty looks, the barely concealed disgust at my presence. I'd learned years ago that sometimes it was easier to accept your place as an outsider than to keep fighting for acceptance that would never come. The pastor, a man my father had probably never met but who spoke about him like they'd been best friends, droned on about Richard's legacy of generosity and his devotion to family. I almost laughed at that last part. Devotion to family. Unless that family member disappointed you by choosing passion over profit, dreams over dynasty. My mind drifted back to the last conversation I'd had with my father, 5 years ago in his corner office on the 40th floor of the Thompson building. I could still see the disappointment in his eyes when I told him I was dropping out of business school to pursue music. Music? He'd said, the word dripping with contempt. Rachel, you're throwing away everything I've built for you. Everything I've worked for. Dad, I can't live your life for you. I need to follow my own path. Your own path? He'd stood up, towering over me in that way that used to make me feel small when I was a child. Your own path leads to poverty, Rachel. To insignificance. Is that what you want? I want to be happy. Happiness is a luxury you can afford when you have money. Without it, happiness is just another word for delusion. That was the last time we spoke. Not because of one argument, but because it was the culmination of years of feeling like I was never good enough, never the daughter he wanted me to be. He'd wanted me to marry well, to use my Thompson name and inheritance to build the family empire even larger. Instead, I'd chosen to struggle as a musician in Nashville, playing in dive bars and coffee shops, barely making ends meet, but feeling more alive than I ever had in Chicago. The irony wasn't lost on me that here I was, 5 years later, still struggling financially while my half-siblings had spent those same 5 years getting richer off money they'd never earned. Marcus had been given a vice president position at the company straight out of college. with a salary that was probably 10 times what I made in a year. Sophia had been set up with a trust fund that let her live like a socialite without any responsibilities. And me? I was living paycheck to paycheck, playing music for tips, driving a car that barely ran, and wearing clothes from thrift stores. According to my family, I'd made my choice, and this was where that choice had led me. "Let us pray," the pastor said, and the entire cathedral fell silent except for the soft sobbing coming from the front pews. Victoria's grief seemed genuine enough, though I wondered how much of it was for my father, and how much was worry about what his death might mean for her lifestyle. I didn't pray. Instead, I studied the faces around me. All these people who'd known my father as a business partner, a client, a powerful man to be courted and flattered. But how many of them had known him as a person? How many had seen him on a Sunday morning, making pancakes in his pajamas, or heard him laugh at terrible dad jokes? Those memories belonged to me, from before Victoria, before Marcus and Sophia, before money and expectations and disappointment drove us apart. I remembered the father who taught me to ride a bike, who came to every school play, who told me I could be anything I wanted to be. Back when love wasn't conditional on making choices he approved of. The service was ending now, and I watched as the family filed out of their reserved pews. Victoria walked with the dignity of someone who'd practiced this moment, accepting condolences with gracious nods and appropriate tears. Marcus and Sophia flanked her like bodyguards, looking appropriately somber, while probably calculating their inheritance in their heads. As they passed my row, Victoria's eyes met mine for just a moment. The look she gave me was pure ice, not grief or anger, but dismissal, like I was a problem that had already been solved, a threat that had already been neutralized. Her expression said what her words had been saying for years. "You don't belong here." Marcus didn't even glance in my direction, but Sophia did. My half-sister looked me up and down with barely concealed disgust, taking in my cheap dress, my worn shoes, my lack of jewelry or expensive accessories. Then she leaned over to whisper something to Marcus that made him smirk. I knew what they were thinking. Poor Rachel, the failure, the disappointment, showing up to Dad's funeral dressed like a waitress. How embarrassing for the family. How typical that she'd try to insert herself into this moment when she'd chosen to remove herself from our lives years ago. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my father and I had been in contact for the past year. Not openly, not in a way that would have threatened his relationship with Victoria or changed the family dynamic, but quietly, privately, through letters and occasional phone calls when he was alone in his office late at night. It had started with a letter he'd sent to my Nashville address, a formal piece of stationery with the Thompson Development letterhead. Inside, in his careful handwriting, he'd written, "Rachel, I may not understand your choices, but I never stopped loving you. Your father." That letter had led to others, and eventually to conversations where we'd talked about everything except the things that had driven us apart. He'd told me about his health problems, which the family had been keeping quiet. I'd told him about my music, my small victories and constant struggles. We'd both avoided the topic of money, inheritance, or what would happen after he was gone. But now he was gone, and I was standing in the back of his funeral, watching the family that had never accepted me mourn the man they'd shared but never really known. The receiving line had formed outside the cathedral, and I debated whether to join it. Part of me wanted to just slip away, drive back to Nashville, and let them have their grief without the complication of my presence. But another part of me knew this was my last chance to pay my respects publicly, to be acknowledged as Richard Thompson's daughter one final time. I decided to stay, not for them, but for him. And for myself. The receiving line moved slowly, giving me plenty of time to observe the interactions ahead of me. Business associates offered firm handshakes and promises to take care of Victoria during this difficult time. Society friends air-kissed and made plans for lunch, once things settled down. Politicians spoke in careful phrases that acknowledged Richard's contributions, while positioning themselves for future opportunities. When my turn finally came, Victoria's reaction was exactly what I'd expected. Her face went rigid with shock and displeasure at seeing me in the receiving line. For just a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked, and I saw the calculation behind her grief. She was wondering what my presence meant, what I might want, what threat I might pose to the careful world she'd built around my father's money. "Rachel," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume for people nearby to hear. "How unexpected. I wasn't sure you'd come." "He was my father," I replied simply. "Of course I came." Marcus had moved closer, obviously alerted by his mother's tone. "Rachel, it's been a long time." His handshake was perfunctory, dismissive. "I hope you're doing well." The pause before doing well was deliberate, designed to remind everyone within earshot that I was the family failure, the one who'd chosen poverty over prosperity. "I'm exactly where I want to be," I said, meeting his eyes steadily. "I hope you can say the same." Sophia didn't even pretend to be civil. "Well, well, the prodigal daughter returns, though I don't see any fatted calf being prepared." She looked me up and down again, making sure everyone noticed my cheap clothing. "Nashville treating you well? You look tired." The word tired carried the weight of years of family judgment. Tired meant poor, unsuccessful, regretful. It meant I should be ashamed of the choices I'd made, and grateful they were even acknowledging my existence. "Thank you for your concern," I said evenly. "I'm sure this must be a difficult day for all of you." What I didn't say was that their behavior at their father's funeral told me everything I needed to know about who they really were. Even in grief, even in public, they couldn't resist the opportunity to remind me of my place in the family hierarchy. As I moved past them, I heard Sophia whisper to her mother, "Can you believe she actually showed up? And dressed like that? It's like she's deliberately trying to embarrass us." "Just ignore her," Victoria whispered back. "After tomorrow, it won't matter anyway." Tomorrow. The will reading. The moment when my father's vast fortune would be officially divided among his survivors, cementing the family power structure for the next generation. The moment when my exile from the Thompson legacy would become permanent and legal. Or so they thought. As I walked toward my beat-up Honda, past all the luxury cars that represented the life I'd rejected, I felt a strange sense of peace. Tomorrow, everything would change. The family that had spent years mocking me, dismissing me, treating me like I didn't matter, was about to learn that my father had been full of surprises. And the biggest surprise of all was waiting for them in his last will and testament. The next morning, I woke up in the cheapest motel I could find near downtown Chicago, surrounded by the kind of luxury I'd grown up with but had long since stopped missing. Well, that wasn't entirely true. I missed the comfort, the security, the simple ease of never worrying about money. But I didn't miss the strings that came attached to Thompson family wealth, or the person I'd had to pretend to be to deserve it. My phone had been buzzing since 6 a.m. with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Reporters probably having caught wind of Richard Thompson's death and looking for family statements. I'd learned years ago to never answer unknown numbers. Nothing good ever came from talking to the press about family business. But the call that came at 9 a.m. was from a number I did recognize, Harrison and Associates, my father's law firm. The same firm that had been handling Thompson family legal matters for 3 decades, and the same firm where I'd done a summer internship during college before I'd disappointed everyone by abandoning the law for music. "Miss Thompson? This is Margaret Harrison. I need to speak with you about your father's will." Margaret Harrison. I remembered her from that summer internship, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 60s, who'd built one of Chicago's most prestigious law practices. She'd been one of my father's closest advisors, and frankly, I was surprised she was calling me at all. "Mrs. Harrison, I'm honored that you reached out, but I think there might be some mistake. My father and I were estranged. I doubt I'm mentioned in his will." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Margaret spoke again, her voice carried a weight I couldn't interpret. "Miss Thompson, I need you to be at my office this afternoon at 2 o'clock for the reading of your father's will. Your presence is not optional. It's required by the terms of the document." Required? That was an odd word choice for someone who'd been cut out of the family fortune. "Mrs. Harrison, are you sure? I mean, my stepmother and half-siblings are the ones who—" "Rachel." She used my first name, which surprised me. "Trust me when I say you need to be here. 2 o'clock. Don't be late." The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone in confusion. Required by the terms of the document? What could that possibly mean? The most likely explanation was that my father had left me some small token, maybe a few $1,000s or a piece of jewelry that had belonged to my mother, and the lawyers needed my signature to make the distribution official. Still, something about Margaret's tone bothered me. She'd sounded almost apologetic, like she knew something I didn't and felt sorry for me because of it. Which made no sense, because what was there to feel sorry about? I'd made my choice to leave the family business and fortune behind. I'd accepted the consequences of that choice years ago. I spent the morning walking around downtown Chicago, revisiting places from my childhood. The Art Institute, where my father had taken me on Sunday afternoons before Victoria came into our lives. Millennium Park, where we'd listen to outdoor concerts during the summer. The Thompson Building itself, where I'd spent countless hours as a child, playing in his office while he worked late into the evening. Looking up at that building now, 40 stories of glass and steel that represented my father's empire, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride in what he'd accomplished, sadness for what we'd lost, and a strange sense of finality. After today, after the will reading, my connection to all of this would be severed permanently. I'd go back to Nashville, back to my small life and big dreams, and the Thompson legacy would belong to Marcus, Sophia, and Victoria. At 1:45 p.m., I walked into the offices of Harrison & Associates, feeling exactly as out of place as I had at the funeral. The lobby was all marble and mahogany, designed to intimidate and impress. The receptionist, a young woman who probably made more money than I did, looked me up and down with barely concealed confusion. Clearly, I didn't look like someone who belonged in a meeting about a multi-million-dollar estate. "I'm here for the Thompson will reading," I told her. "Of course. Conference room A. You're the last to arrive." The last to arrive. Of course I was. The family had probably been here for an hour, getting briefed on procedures, reviewing documents, preparing for the moment when they'd officially inherit everything Richard Thompson had built. Conference room A was intimidating in its formality. A long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs, law books lining the walls, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Sitting around that table were all the people who'd made my life miserable for the past decade. Victoria sat at the head of the table like she was already the family matriarch, dressed in an expensive black suit that somehow managed to be both mourning-appropriate and business-ready. Her makeup was perfect, her hair styled precisely, every detail calculated to project the image of a grieving widow who was ready to shoulder the burden of managing vast wealth. Marcus sat to her right, looking like he'd stepped out of a Fortune 500 magazine. His suit probably cost more than my car, and he had that confident air of someone who'd never doubted that success was his birthright. He was reviewing a stack of papers with the focused attention of someone studying for the most important test of his life. Sophia was to Victoria's left, and while she was dressed appropriately for the occasion, I could see her phone on the table, lit up with social media notifications. Even at her father's will reading, she couldn't resist the pull of Instagram and TikTok, though I supposed when you were about to inherit millions, you could afford to be a little distracted. The rest of the table was filled with extended family members, aunts and uncles who'd been living comfortable lives thanks to their connection to Thompson money, cousins who'd been given jobs at the company despite having no real qualifications, in-laws who'd married into the fortune and never let anyone forget it. And then there was me, sitting in the last empty chair at the far end of the table, as physically separated from the family power center as I'd been emotionally separated for years. Margaret Harrison sat at the opposite end of the table from Victoria, flanked by 2 associate attorneys and a pile of legal documents that looked thick enough to choke a horse. When I entered the room, she looked up and gave me a nod that seemed almost sympathetic. "Now that everyone is here," Margaret began, "we can proceed with the reading of Richard Thompson's last will and testament. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that the contents of this document are confidential, and I expect everyone in this room to maintain that confidentiality." Victoria leaned forward slightly, her hands folded on the table. "Of course, Margaret. We all understand the gravity of this moment." "Good." Margaret picked up the first document from her pile. "Richard's will is quite detailed, so I'll be summarizing the major provisions rather than reading every word. The document was executed 18 months ago and has been updated several times since then, most recently 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago. That would have been right around the time my father and I had our last phone conversation. when he'd told me about his latest doctor's appointment and the grim prognosis he'd been given. I'd thought he sounded different during that call, more reflective, more serious about topics we usually avoided. "The will begins with personal bequests," Margaret continued. "To his brother James Thompson, Richard leaves his collection of vintage watches and his membership in the Chicago Athletic Club." Uncle James nodded solemnly, though I could see the calculation in his eyes. Those watches were worth at least $100,000, and the club membership was both valuable and prestigious. To his sister Catherine Thompson Walsh, he leaves his art collection and wine cellar. Aunt Catherine actually smiled at that news. My father's art collection was worth several $1,000,000, and his wine cellar was legendary among Chicago's social elite. Margaret continued through a list of smaller bequests: jewelry to various female relatives, cash gifts to longtime employees, charitable donations to causes my father had supported. Each bequest was generous, but not surprising. This was exactly the kind of methodical distribution you'd expect from a successful businessman. But I noticed something odd. With each bequest Margaret announced, she glanced in my direction. Not obviously, not in a way that anyone else would notice, but definitely looking at me like she was checking my reaction. "Now we come to the major provisions of the will," Margaret said, and the room fell completely silent. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The moment when Richard Thompson's business empire and vast personal wealth would be distributed among his survivors. Victoria straightened in her chair, looking every inch the bereaved widow ready to shoulder the burden of managing enormous wealth. Marcus set down his papers and gave Margaret his full attention. Even Sophia put down her phone and focused on the lawyer. "To my beloved wife Victoria," Margaret read, "I leave the sum of $5 million, the house in Lake Forest, the condo in Aspen, and all jewelry and personal effects I purchased for her during our marriage. $5 million. The house alone was worth at least $3 million, and the Aspen condo was probably worth $2 million more. Victoria had just inherited enough money to live comfortably for the rest of her life, but I could see from her expression that she'd been expecting more. Much more. To my son Marcus," Margaret continued, "I leave $2 million and a position on the board of Thompson Development Corporation, with the understanding that he will continue to earn his place in the company through merit and dedication. $2 million and a board position." Marcus tried to look pleased, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. He'd been expecting to inherit control of the company, not just a board seat. And $2 million, while substantial, was nowhere near enough to fund the lifestyle he'd been planning. To my daughter Sophia, I leave $2 million in a trust fund to be administered by Harrison and Associates, with quarterly distributions beginning on her 25th birthday. Sophia's face went white. A trust fund with quarterly distributions meant she wouldn't have access to the principal, just regular payments. For someone who'd been expecting total financial freedom, this was practically house arrest. But it was the amount that was really shocking everyone in the room. My father had been worth an estimated $50 million, and so far Margaret had distributed less than $15 million. Where was the rest? The room was dead silent as everyone did the math. Victoria, Marcus, and Sophia had just inherited substantial amounts, but not the controlling shares of Thompson Development Corporation, not the bulk of my father's investments, not the real wealth that would allow them to maintain their positions as Chicago's elite. Margaret looked around the room, and I could see that she was enjoying this moment far more than a grieving family's lawyer should. The remainder of Richard Thompson's estate, including all shares in Thompson Development Corporation, his investment portfolio, his real estate holdings not previously mentioned, and all other assets not specifically bequested, goes to... The pause seemed to last forever. Victoria was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles had turned white. Marcus was staring at Margaret like he could force her to say his name through sheer willpower. Sophia looked like she might faint. His daughter, Rachel Thompson. The words hit the room like a bomb going off. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Then chaos erupted. "That's impossible!" Victoria shouted, jumping to her feet. "Richard would never... There has to be some mistake." "There's no mistake," Margaret said calmly. "Rachel inherits approximately $35 million in assets, including controlling interest in Thompson Development Corporation. $35 million. I felt like I was falling through space, like the expensive leather chair beneath me had disappeared, and I was tumbling through an endless void of shock and disbelief. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. Marcus was on his feet now, too, his face red with rage. This is fraudulent. She hasn't been part of this family for years. She abandoned us, abandoned the company, abandoned everything Dad built. The will is valid and legally binding, Margaret replied, her voice cutting through the chaos. It was executed in full compliance with Illinois state law, and Richard was of sound mind and body when he signed it. Sophia was crying now, ugly, gasping sobs that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the lifestyle she just watched disappear. But she doesn't deserve it. She left. She chose to be poor. Why would Daddy give her everything? Margaret looked at me, and I saw something in her expression that might have been approval. Perhaps Rachel would like to read the letter your father left for her. It might explain his reasoning. Letter? What letter? Margaret was holding out an envelope with my name written on it in my father's careful handwriting. With shaking hands, I took it and opened it, aware that everyone in the room was staring at me with expressions ranging from fury to disbelief. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered with my father's words. My dearest Rachel, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've just learned that you're now one of the wealthiest women in Chicago. I imagine you're as shocked as everyone else in that room. I want you to know that this decision wasn't made in anger or spite, though I'm sure your stepfamily will claim otherwise. It was made out of love and respect for the woman you've become. 5 years ago, when you chose music over money, dreams over dynasty, I thought you were making the biggest mistake of your life. I was wrong. You were choosing to be true to yourself, rather than living up to someone else's expectations. That takes a courage I'm not sure I ever possessed. Victoria, Marcus, and Sophia have spent years believing that wealth was their birthright, that success was something they deserved, rather than something they earned. They've lived off my money without ever understanding the sacrifices required to build it. You, on the other hand, chose to earn your own way. You've struggled, failed, gotten back up, and struggled again. You've learned the value of $1, because you've had to work for everyone. You understand what it means to build something from nothing, because you've been doing it for 5 years. I'm not giving you this inheritance because I want you to become like them. I'm giving it to you because I trust you to remain who you are, even with all this money. Use it wisely. Use it to make the world better. Use it to prove that the Thompson name can stand for something more than just profit. Your loving father, Richard Thompson, P.S. Margaret has some additional documents for you. Trust her guidance. She's been helping me plan this for over a year. By the time I finished reading, tears were streaming down my face. Not just because of the money, though the financial security was overwhelming, but because my father had seen me, really seen me, in a way I'd never thought he could. The room was still in chaos around me. Victoria was shouting at Margaret about challenging the will in court. Marcus was demanding to see documentation proving my father's mental competency. Sophia was alternating between sobbing and screaming about how unfair this was. But through it all, Margaret Harrison was calmly explaining that the will was ironclad, that it had been reviewed by multiple attorneys, and that any legal challenge would be expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately futile. Furthermore, Margaret said, raising her voice to be heard over the family's outrage, the will includes a specific clause about challenges. Anyone who contests the will forfeits their inheritance entirely. That shut them up fast. Victoria, Marcus, and Sophia might be furious, but they weren't stupid. Losing a few million was bad enough. Losing everything would be catastrophic. As the reality of the situation sank in, the family's shock turned to something uglier. The masks came off, and I saw them as they really were. You planned this, Victoria hissed, turning on me with venom in her eyes. You manipulated a sick old man into changing his will. You used your relationship with him to steal what rightfully belongs to his real family. I had no idea, I said quietly. I'm as shocked as you are. Bullshit. Marcus slammed his hand on the table. You conniving little bitch. You think you can just waltz back into our lives and steal everything we've worked for? What exactly have you worked for? The words came out before I could stop them. 5 years of suppressed anger finally finding their voice. What have any of you actually earned? You've been living off his money your entire lives, contributing nothing, expecting everything. That's when Sophia completely lost it. "You don't belong here. You're not even really part of this family. You're just the daughter of his first wife, the one who was too weak to handle being married to a powerful man." The reference to my mother, who died when I was 10, was designed to hurt. And it did. But it also clarified something for me. These people had never seen me as family. They'd tolerated my presence when I was useful, when I was following the script they'd written for my life. The moment I'd chosen my own path, I'd become the enemy. "I think we're done here," Margaret said, standing up and beginning to gather her papers. "Rachel, I'll need to meet with you privately to discuss the details of your inheritance. Everyone else, my office will be in touch regarding the logistics of transferring your bequests." As people began filing out of the conference room, I felt a strange sense of unreality. 24 hours ago, I'd been a struggling musician living paycheck to paycheck. Now I was worth $35 million and controlled one of Chicago's largest real estate development companies. Victoria stopped at the door and turned back to look at me one last time. "This isn't over, Rachel. We'll find a way to prove you manipulated him. We'll find a way to get back what's ours." "No," I said, finally finding my voice. "What's yours is exactly what he left you. What's mine is what he chose to leave me. The difference is, I'll actually deserve it." After everyone else had left, Margaret sat back down across from me. "That went about as well as I expected," she said, with a slight smile. "You knew this would happen. Rachel, your father and I spent over a year planning this moment. We knew exactly how they would react, and we prepared accordingly." She pulled out another folder. "Which brings me to the additional documents your father mentioned. There's more? Much more. Your father wasn't just giving you money, Rachel. He was giving you the tools to completely reshape his legacy. And if you're willing to use them, you can give your stepfamily a lesson they'll never forget." As Margaret opened that folder and began explaining my father's final secret plan, I realized that inheriting his fortune was just the beginning. The real question was what I was going to do with the power he'd just placed in my hands. And looking at the documents Margaret was showing me, I was starting to understand that my father's revenge on the family that had treated his daughter like an outsider was going to be far more comprehensive than anyone could have imagined. 3 hours later, I walked out of Margaret Harrison's office with my head spinning and a briefcase full of documents that would change everything. What I'd thought was a simple inheritance of money and property was actually something far more complex and devastating. A carefully orchestrated plan that my father had been developing for over a year. Margaret had explained it all with the methodical precision of someone who'd helped design every detail. "Your father didn't just want to leave you his wealth, Rachel. He wanted to give you the power to expose the truth about what your stepfamily has really been doing with Thompson money." The documents in my briefcase told a story that was both shocking and infuriating. For the past 5 years, while I'd been struggling to make ends meet in Nashville, Victoria, Marcus, and Sophia had been systematically looting Thompson Development Corporation from the inside. It had started small. Victoria using company credit cards for personal expenses, spa treatments, designer shopping trips, vacations that were classified as business travel, but were obviously pleasure trips. Then, Marcus had begun funneling company money into personal investment accounts, claiming the transactions were legitimate business expenses. Sophia had been the most brazen, actually forging my father's signature on checks made out to cash, sometimes for amounts as large as $50,000. "How did my father find out?" I'd asked Margaret. "He hired a private investigator about 18 months ago. He'd been noticing discrepancies in the company books, money that couldn't be accounted for, expenses that didn't make sense." Margaret had pulled out a thick file of investigative reports. What the investigator found was embezzlement on a massive scale. "Your stepfamily has stolen approximately $8 million from Thompson Development over the past 5 years. $8 million. While I'd been eating ramen noodles and choosing between paying rent or buying groceries, they'd been stealing enough money to fund my entire lifestyle for several lifetimes. But the theft was only part of the story. The private investigator had also uncovered evidence of corporate espionage, tax fraud, and conspiracy to defraud business partners. Victoria had been selling confidential Thompson Development information to competitors. Marcus had been manipulating project bids to benefit companies he had secret investments in. Sophia had been using her access to company files to insider trade on real estate deals. "Why didn't he have them arrested?" I'd asked. Margaret's smile had been cold and satisfied. Because he had a better idea. He decided to let them inherit just enough money to feel secure, while giving you the evidence to destroy them completely. Your father's final gift isn't just wealth, Rachel. It's justice. Now, sitting in my rental car outside Margaret's office, I was trying to process the magnitude of what I'd just learned. I wasn't just rich now, I was powerful. I had the ability to send my stepfamily to prison, to destroy their reputations, to take back every penny they'd stolen and more. But more than that, I had the opportunity to reshape Thompson Development Corporation into something that actually reflected the values my father had claimed to believe in. For years, under Victoria's influence, the company had become increasingly focused on profit over people, cutting corners on safety, exploiting workers, and prioritizing short-term gains over long-term stability. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Victoria." I stared at that message for a long moment, considering my options. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let them stew in their anger and confusion while I figured out my next move. But another part of me was curious about what Victoria could possibly want to say to me now. I texted back, "I'm listening." Her response came immediately. Not over text. "Meet me at the Palmer House, lobby bar, 1 hour. The Palmer House. Of course she'd choose somewhere public and expensive, somewhere she could maintain the illusion of being Chicago royalty, even while her world crumbled around her. I drove to the Palmer House with the briefcase of evidence sitting on my passenger seat like a loaded weapon. Every red light gave me time to think about what Victoria might want, what she might offer, what desperate scheme she might be hatching to try to salvage her situation. The Palmer House lobby bar was exactly what I'd expected. All marble and crystal and the kind of old money elegance that Victoria loved to surround herself with. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a martini in front of her, looking like she was holding court at her personal kingdom. But there were cracks in her facade that I'd never seen before. Her makeup was still perfect, her hair still styled precisely, but there was something desperate in her eyes, something that suggested the confident widow act was starting to crumble. "Rachel," she said as I approached the table, "thank you for coming." I sat down across from her without ordering a drink. "What do you want, Victoria?" She took a sip of her martini, clearly stalling for time. "I want to make you an offer. I'm listening. This inheritance, it's going to destroy our family. Marcus was supposed to take over the company. Sophia was supposed to be set for life. This changes everything." "That's the point," I said quietly. "Dad wanted things to change. Your father was sick, Rachel. Confused. He wasn't thinking clearly when he made those changes to his will." Victoria leaned forward, her voice taking on the manipulative tone I remembered from my teenage years. "But it's not too late to fix this. You could share the inheritance voluntarily, set up trusts for Marcus and Sophia, give them real control in the company, keep the family together." "Why would I do that?" "Because we're family," she said, as if that word meant anything coming from her. "Because your father would have wanted his children to take care of each other." I almost laughed. "Family? Victoria, you spent 12 years making it clear that I wasn't really part of this family. You, Marcus, and Sophia have treated me like an embarrassment, a failure, someone to be tolerated at best and avoided at worst. That's not true. It is true." I kept my voice level, matter of fact. "You want to know what family is? Family is my father writing me letters for the past year, telling me he was proud of who I'd become. Family is him trusting me with his life's work, because he knew I'd use it responsibly." Victoria's mask slipped a little more. "Rachel, be practical. You don't know anything about running a business. You've been playing guitar in dive bars for 5 years. Thompson Development is a complex operation with hundreds of employees and millions in assets. You'll destroy everything your father built. Will I? Or will I finally build it into something he actually wanted it to be?" That's when her desperation really showed. "What do you want? Money? More money? I can make that happen. The family has other assets, other investments. We can make you a very wealthy woman even without the bulk of the inheritance. I'm already a very wealthy woman, Victoria. That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" Her voice was rising, and other patrons were starting to glance in our direction. "What do you want from us?" I reached into my briefcase and pulled out one of the investigative reports Margaret had given me. I slid it across the table to Victoria, and watched her face go pale as she recognized what it was. "I want you to explain this," I said quietly. Victoria's hands were shaking as she opened the file. Inside were bank records, credit card statements, forged checks, and detailed documentation of 5 years' worth of theft. Her theft. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "My father had you investigated, Victoria. All of you. He knew about the embezzlement, the fraud, the corporate espionage. He knew everything." She looked up at me with genuine fear in her eyes for the first time. "Rachel, you don't understand. The expenses, they were legitimate. Business entertainment, client relations. A $50,000 spa weekend in Napa is not business entertainment." I pulled out another document. "Neither is a $200,000 diamond necklace charged to the company's office supplies budget." Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. "You can't prove anything. Those could be forgeries, fabrications. They're not, and we both know it." I gathered the papers back up and put them in my briefcase. "My father documented everything, Victoria. Every fraudulent transaction, every forged signature, every stolen dollar. The question isn't whether I can prove it. It's what I'm going to do with the proof. What do you want?" The question came out as a broken whisper. "I want you to understand that your family's comfortable life was built on stolen money. I want you to realize that while I was struggling to pay rent, you were stealing from my father's company to fund your lifestyle. I want you to comprehend that the woman you've been treating like a failure for 5 years is now the only thing standing between you and federal prison." Victoria stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. "You've changed." "No," I said, standing up from the table. "I'm exactly who I've always been. You just never bothered to really look." As I walked away from that table, I heard Victoria call out behind me, "Rachel, please, we can work this out. We can find a solution that works for everyone." But I didn't turn around. There was no solution that worked for everyone, because everyone had been stealing from my father while he lay dying, thinking they were clever enough to get away with it forever. The drive back to my motel gave me time to think about what came next. I had enough evidence to destroy Victoria, Marcus, and Sophia completely. I could have them arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned. I could seize all their assets to recover what they'd stolen. I could ruin them so thoroughly that they'd never recover. But was that what my father would have wanted? His letter had talked about using the money wisely, about making the world better, about proving the Thompson name could stand for something more than just profit. Maybe complete destruction wasn't the answer. Maybe there was a better way to get justice, one that would teach them the lessons they needed to learn, while also honoring my father's memory. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed Marcus's number. "What do you want?" I answered. "We need to meet." His voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "All of us. Tonight." "Why?" "Because Mom told us about your little meeting. About the evidence you claim to have." "It's not a claim, Marcus. It's fact." "Then we need to discuss terms." "Terms? Like this was a business negotiation instead of a reckoning for years of theft and betrayal." "What kind of terms?" "The kind that keep this family out of prison and keep Thompson Development from being destroyed by scandal." I considered his words. Maybe a face-to-face confrontation was exactly what we needed. Maybe it was time for them to understand the full scope of what they'd done and what it was going to cost them. "Fine," I said. "But we meet on my terms, at my location." "Where?" I smiled, thinking of the perfect place to have this conversation. "Thompson Development Headquarters, Dad's office, 9 o'clock tonight." "Rachel, that's not..." "9 o'clock, Marcus. Come alone, or bring Victoria and Sophia. But if you want to discuss terms, we do it where Dad built his empire. The empire you've been stealing from." I hung up before he could argue, then called Margaret Harrison to let her know what was happening. "Are you sure about this, Rachel?" she asked. Confronting them directly could be risky. "Margaret, they've spent years thinking they were smarter than everyone else, thinking they could steal and lie and manipulate without consequences. It's time they learned they were wrong. And if they try to threaten you, or claim you're the one who's been embezzling..." I looked at the briefcase full of evidence sitting beside me. Then I show them exactly how much proof I have of their crimes, and I remind them that I'm the one who controls their future now. That evening, As I rode the elevator up to the 40th floor of the Thompson building, I thought about all the times I'd made this same journey as a child. Back then, this building had represented everything I wanted to be when I grew up. Successful, powerful, important. Then it had become everything I was running away from. Cold, impersonal, focused only on profit. Tonight, it was going to become something else entirely. Tonight, it was going to be the place where the Thompson family finally faced the truth about who they really were. The elevator doors opened, and I walked down the familiar hallway toward my father's office. The lights were already on, and I could hear voices through the heavy wooden door. Victoria, Marcus, and Sophia were already there, probably strategizing, trying to figure out how to minimize the damage I could do to their lives. I took a deep breath, adjusted my grip on the briefcase, and opened the door to begin the most important negotiation of my life. My father's office hadn't changed since the last time I'd been there 5 years ago. The same massive mahogany desk dominated the room, flanked by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of downtown Chicago. The same leather chairs where I'd done homework as a child were arranged around a conference table that had hosted deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But tonight, that office felt different. Tonight, it belonged to me. Victoria, Marcus, and Sophia were already seated around the conference table, looking like defendants waiting for a verdict. They'd clearly been talking strategy before I arrived. Their heads were close together, and they fell silent the moment I walked in. "Thank you all for coming," I said, setting my briefcase on my father's desk with deliberate ceremony. "I thought it was appropriate to have this conversation here, in the place where Dad built everything you've been stealing from." Marcus stood up, his face flushed with anger. "We didn't steal anything, Rachel. Every expense was legitimate business. Sit down, Marcus." My voice was calm but firm. "You'll get your chance to talk, but first you're going to listen." Something in my tone made him hesitate. Maybe it was the fact that I was standing behind our father's desk, in his office, surrounded by the evidence of the empire he'd built. Or maybe it was the simple reality that I now controlled their futures. Either way, he sat back down. I opened my briefcase and began spreading documents across the conference table. Bank statements, credit card records, forged checks, receipts for personal expenses charged to company accounts. 5 years' worth of systematic theft, laid out in chronological order like a timeline of betrayal. "Let's start with you, Victoria," I said, picking up a thick folder. Spa treatments in Napa charged to client entertainment. $100,000 jewelry shopping spree charged to office supplies. First-class trips to Paris charged to business development. Victoria's face was stone, but I could see her hands trembling slightly. Those were legitimate business expenses. I was representing the company. At a spa? For a week? With no business meetings, no client contact, no company purpose whatsoever? I slid the receipts across the table to her. "The private investigator Dad hired followed you, Victoria. He has photos, credit card records, witness statements. You weren't representing the company. You were stealing from it." I turned to Marcus next. "And then we have your creative accounting, Marcus. Funneling company money into personal investment accounts, claiming they were legitimate business partnerships that somehow never generated any return for Thompson Development." Marcus's confident facade was cracking. "Those were exploratory investments, market research. Sometimes investments don't pan out. Investments in cryptocurrency accounts registered under your personal name, investments in real estate that somehow ended up titled to you personally." I pulled out another set of documents. $2 million, Marcus. You've stolen $2 million from Dad's company over the past 3 years. Finally, I turned to Sophia. "And you, little sister, the most brazen of all, forging Dad's signature on checks made out to cash, sometimes 50,000 at a time." Sophia had been crying since I started talking, but now she looked up with something like defiance. "I needed that money. Do you know how expensive it is to maintain the lifestyle expected of a Thompson daughter?" "No," I said quietly. "I don't, because I never stole to maintain my lifestyle. I chose to live within my means instead of stealing from my father." The room fell silent except for Sophia's sniffling. I could see them processing the reality of their situation, understanding for the first time that they weren't going to be able to lie or manipulate their way out of this. "So here's where we stand," I continued, moving back to stand behind my father's desk. "Between the three of you, You've embezzled approximately $8 million from Thompson Development Corporation over the past 5 years. That's $8 million in theft, fraud, forgery, and corporate espionage. What do you want? Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I want you to understand what you've done. I want you to comprehend that while I was struggling to pay rent, eating ramen noodles, and choosing between gas money and groceries, you were funding your luxury lifestyles with stolen money. We thought you were never coming back, Marcus said defensively. You abandoned the family, abandoned the company. You thought what? That Dad's money was yours to steal because his eldest daughter had disappointed you? My voice was rising despite my efforts to stay calm. You thought that my choosing to follow my dreams instead of your script gave you the right to rob him blind? That's not what Sophia started. That's exactly what you thought. I leaned forward, placing my hands on the desk. You thought I was weak. You thought I was a failure. You thought I was someone you could dismiss and ignore while you built your lives on stolen money. Victoria finally found her voice again. What do you want, Rachel? Money? An apology? What will it take to make this go away? Make this go away? I stared at her in disbelief. Victoria, you've committed multiple felonies. All of you have. This isn't something that just goes away because it's inconvenient for you. You could choose not to prosecute, Marcus said quickly. You could choose to handle this as a family matter instead of involving the authorities. I could, I agreed. But why would I? Because we're family, Sophia said through her tears. Because Dad wouldn't have wanted his children to go to prison. Dad didn't want his children to steal from him either. But that didn't stop you. I walked around the desk to stand directly in front of them. Let me tell you what I think happened. I think Dad started noticing the discrepancies in the company books about 2 years ago. I think he hired the private investigator, discovered what you were doing, and realized that the family he'd been supporting was systematically robbing him. Rachel, Victoria started. I think that's when he started reaching out to me again. Not just because he missed me, but because he realized that the daughter he'd written off as a failure was actually the only one with any integrity left. The truth of that statement hung in the air like a physical presence. For years, they'd seen my choice to pursue music as evidence of weakness, failure, lack of ambition. They'd never considered that it might actually be evidence of strength. The strength to choose authenticity over comfort, principles over profit. So here's what's going to happen, I continued. You're each going to write me a detailed confession of every crime you've committed against Thompson Development Corporation. Every stolen dollar, every forged signature, every fraudulent expense. And if we do that, Marcus asked, then we'll discuss terms for keeping you out of federal prison. Victoria leaned forward urgently. What kind of terms? Full restitution, obviously. Every penny you've stolen gets paid back with interest. That's impossible, Sophia said immediately. We don't have $8 million. Then you'll sell everything. The jewelry, the cars, the real estate, the investments you bought with stolen money. You'll liquidate everything and pay back what you can. And the rest? Marcus asked. The rest gets deducted from your inheritance. Dad left you each $2 million? Congratulations. That money now goes to paying back what you stole from his company. The math was brutal, but fair. Even with their inheritances and whatever they could raise by selling their ill-gotten assets, they'd still fall short of full restitution, which meant they'd spend years in debt, years living with the consequences of their choices. Rachel, please, Victoria said, and for the first time since I'd known her, she sounded genuinely desperate. You're talking about destroying our lives. No, I replied. I'm talking about holding you accountable for the choices you made. You destroyed your own lives when you decided to steal from a dying man. He wasn't dying when Sophia started, then stopped as she realized what she'd just admitted. When you what, Sophia? When you started stealing from him? So you're saying you didn't wait until he was sick and vulnerable. You started robbing him when he was healthy and trusting. Sophia's face crumpled as she realized she'd just made their situation worse. Here's what else is going to happen, I continued. You're all going to resign from any positions you hold at Thompson Development Corporation, effective immediately. Rachel, you can't, Marcus started. I can, and I am. Victoria, you're no longer on the board of directors. Marcus, you're no longer a vice president. "Sophia, your internship is terminated." "But what will we do?" Sophia asked, panic clear in her voice. "You'll get jobs, real jobs, where you actually work for your money instead of stealing it." The concept seemed to terrify them more than the threat of prison. They'd spent their entire adult lives living off Thompson money, never having to actually earn their own way in the world. "And finally," I said, returning to my father's desk and pulling out one last document, "you're going to sign this agreement acknowledging your crimes and accepting these terms. If you violate any provision of this agreement, if you steal another penny or even jaywalk, I will immediately turn all this evidence over to the federal prosecutor." I slid 3 copies of the agreement across the table. "You have 24 hours to decide. Sign it, and you stay out of prison but lose your comfortable lives. Refuse to sign it, and I'll have FBI agents at your doors tomorrow morning." Victoria picked up her copy with shaking hands. "Rachel, please. There has to be another way." "There is," I said. "You could have chosen not to steal from my father in the first place." Marcus was reading through his copy, his lawyer's training evident as he absorbed the legal language. This is comprehensive. "It's thorough," I agreed. "Just like your theft was thorough." "What about you?" Sophia asked suddenly. "What happens to you? You just become rich and powerful and forget about us?" I considered her question carefully. "I become responsible for everything Dad built. I try to turn Thompson Development into the kind of company he always claimed he wanted it to be. I use the money to make a positive difference instead of just accumulating more wealth." "And us?" Victoria asked. "You learn what it means to earn your own way in the world. You discover whether you have any value beyond your access to Thompson money." I looked at each of them in turn. "Who knows? You might surprise yourselves." As they filed out of the office, clutching their copies of the agreement, I could hear them whispering urgently to each other in the hallway. Planning strategy, probably, trying to figure out if there was any way to escape the consequences of their actions. But I knew they'd sign the agreement. They didn't really have a choice. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and the alternative was federal prison. Alone in my father's office, I sat down in his chair and looked out at the Chicago skyline. Tomorrow, I'd begin the process of transforming Thompson Development Corporation into something that actually reflected the values my father had claimed to believe in. Fair wages, ethical business practices, community investment, environmental responsibility. But tonight, I just sat in that chair and thought about the letter he'd left me. About how he'd finally seen me for who I really was, instead of who he'd wanted me to be. About how he'd trusted me with his life's work, because he knew I'd use it responsibly. My phone buzzed with a message from Margaret Harrison. "How did it go?" I typed back, "Justice is served. Tomorrow we start building something better." Because that's what this was really about. Not revenge, though there was certainly satisfaction in seeing my step-family face the consequences of their actions. It was about proving that the Thompson name could stand for something more than just profit and power. It was about honoring my father's memory by becoming the person he'd finally realized I'd always been. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of Thompson Development Corporation, looking out at the faces of my new management team. The view from the 40th floor was the same, but everything else had changed completely. Gone were the old guard executives who'd enabled Victoria's theft and turned blind eyes to Marcus's fraudulent schemes. In their place sat some of the most ethical, innovative minds in Chicago's business community, people who'd been waiting years for the opportunity to work for a company that actually prioritized doing the right thing over maximizing profit. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, addressing the room with the confidence I'd gained over the past 6 months of running my father's empire, "I'm pleased to announce that Thompson Development has just been awarded the contract for the Southside Community Revitalization Project." The room erupted in applause. This wasn't just any contract. It was a billion-dollar project to rebuild some of Chicago's most underserved neighborhoods, creating affordable housing, community centers, and local business opportunities. It was exactly the kind of project the old Thompson Development would never have bid on, because the profit margins were smaller than what they were used to. But I wasn't interested in maximum profit. I was interested in maximum impact. "This project represents everything we've been working toward," I continued. "Sustainable construction, community investment, fair wages for workers, and long-term value instead of short-term gain. We're not just building buildings. We're building better communities. If you're still watching, make sure to hit that like button, because you won't believe how completely I transformed not just the company, but the lives of everyone who'd tried to destroy me. As the meeting wrapped up and people began filing out, my assistant handed me a stack of messages. Most were from reporters wanting interviews about Thompson Development's radical transformation, or from other business leaders curious about our new approach to corporate responsibility. But one message caught my attention immediately. It was from Marcus. Need to see you. Important. M. I hadn't spoken to Marcus, Victoria, or Sophia since they'd signed the restitution agreement 6 months ago. According to Margaret's reports, they'd all been struggling to adjust to life without access to Thompson money. Victoria had been forced to sell her Lake Forest mansion and move into a modest condo. Marcus was working as an associate at a small law firm, making a fraction of what he'd been making at Thompson Development. Sophia had gotten a job at a nonprofit, her first real job ever. But they'd all been making their restitution payments on time. And as far as I knew, they'd been staying out of trouble. So what could Marcus possibly want to discuss now? I called him back from my father's office. My office now, though I'd redecorated it completely to reflect my own values, rather than his traditional corporate aesthetic. "Rachel," Marcus said when he answered. "Thank you for calling back." "What do you want, Marcus?" I need to see you in person. There's something I need to tell you. Something I couldn't say in front of Mom and Sophia. There was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Humility, maybe. Or genuine remorse. It was so unlike the arrogant, entitled Marcus I'd known that I found myself curious despite my better judgment. "Fine. My office, tomorrow at 10. Actually, could we meet somewhere else? Somewhere more private?" That was an odd request, but I agreed to meet him at a small cafe near downtown, far from the Thompson building and the business community that might recognize us. The next morning, I arrived at the cafe to find Marcus already there, sitting in a corner booth with 2 cups of coffee and looking more nervous than I'd ever seen him. He was wearing a simple navy suit that looked off the rack rather than custom-tailored, and his entire demeanor had changed from the confident executive I remembered to someone who looked genuinely uncomfortable in his own skin. "Thank you for coming," he said, as I sat down across from him. "What's this about, Marcus?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup, like it might provide answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. "I need to tell you something about Dad's death. Something I should have told you months ago." My blood went cold. "What about his death?" "He didn't die of natural causes, Rachel." "Not exactly." The cafe suddenly felt too small, too warm. "What are you saying?" "The heart attack was real, but it wasn't sudden. Dad had been having chest pains for weeks before he died. Severe ones. Mom knew about it. I knew about it. Even Sophia knew. And?" Marcus took a shaky breath. "He wanted to go to the hospital. Multiple times he said he needed to see a doctor. But Mom kept convincing him it was just stress, just overwork. She kept giving him antacids and telling him to rest. Why would she do that? Because she knew about the will changes. She'd seen him meeting with Margaret Harrison, had noticed the private investigator following her around. She knew he'd found out about the embezzlement. The implications of what Marcus was telling me began to sink in like stones dropping through water. "You're saying Victoria deliberately prevented Dad from getting medical treatment?" "I'm saying she knew he was sick, knew he needed help, and chose to delay that help because she was hoping—" Marcus couldn't finish the sentence. "Hoping he'd die before he could change his will any further." Marcus nodded miserably. "By the time we finally called 911, it was too late. The doctors said if he'd come in when the symptoms first started, they probably could have saved him. I felt like the world was tilting underneath me. My father's death hadn't been a tragic but natural end to a long illness. It had been the result of deliberate negligence by a woman who'd been more concerned about protecting her inheritance than saving her husband's life. Why are you telling me this now?" My voice was barely a whisper. "Because I can't live with it anymore. Because these past 6 months working a real job, earning my own money, actually having to face what I did, I've realized what kind of person I became, what kind of people we all became." Marcus was crying now, something I'd never seen him do even as a child. "Rachel, we killed him. Maybe not directly, but we killed him as surely as if we'd put a gun to his head. Our greed, our selfishness, our willingness to steal from him while he was dying. And then Mom's decision to let him suffer, rather than risk losing her inheritance. The cafe was spinning around me. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to anchor myself to something solid, while processing the magnitude of what I'd just learned. "Do you have proof?" I asked. "Some. Text messages between Mom and me about Dad's condition. Phone records showing when we should have called for help versus when we actually did. Medical records showing the timeline of his symptoms." "Why didn't you tell me this when you signed the restitution agreement?" "Because I was still hoping we could all just move on. Pretend it never happened. Because I was still more concerned about protecting myself than doing the right thing." Marcus wiped his eyes with a napkin. "But these past 6 months have been educational." "How so?" "I've learned what it's like to work for money instead of just expecting it. I've learned what it's like to have a boss who actually expects competence and effort. I've learned what it's like to live in an apartment instead of a penthouse, to shop for groceries instead of just charging everything to company accounts." He looked up at me with something like wonder in his expression. "Rachel, I don't know how you did it, how you chose to live that way when you could have had everything handed to you. Because having things handed to you doesn't make you a better person. It just makes you dependent. I understand that now, but it took losing everything to figure it out." We sat in silence for several minutes while I processed what Marcus had told me. My father's death hadn't just been a tragedy, it had been a preventable tragedy, made possible by the greed and selfishness of people who should have loved him. "What do you want me to do with this information?" I finally asked. "I don't know. Whatever you think is right, I couldn't keep carrying this secret anymore." "Have you told Victoria that you've told me?" "No. She thinks I came here to ask you for money, to try to negotiate better terms on our restitution payments." "And Sophia?" "Sophia doesn't know I'm here at all. She's not handling the adjustment well. The job, the smaller apartment, actually having to be responsible for herself. She's angry all the time, blames you for everything that's happened to us." I thought about my half-sister, who'd never worked a day in her life until 6 months ago, suddenly forced to live like a normal person instead of a pampered princess. It probably was difficult for her, though not as difficult as it had been for me to build a life from nothing while they lived off stolen money. "Marcus, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you actually regret what you did? Or do you just regret getting caught?" He considered the question seriously, which was more than I'd expected. 6 months ago, I would have said I just regretted getting caught. But now, I think I actually regret what I did. Not just because of the consequences, but because of what it says about who I was, who you were. I'm trying to be a different person now. Someone who earns what he has. Someone who contributes instead of just taking. It's harder than I thought it would be, but it's also better, more honest. I studied Marcus's face, looking for signs of manipulation or deception, but what I saw looked like genuine remorse, genuine change. Maybe people really could learn from their mistakes if the consequences were severe enough. "I need time to think about what you've told me," I said. "I understand. But Rachel, whatever you decide to do, I want you to know that I'm sorry. Not just for getting caught, but for what we did, for what we took from you, for how we treated you, for what we cost Dad." As I drove back to the Thompson building, my mind was racing with the implications of what Marcus had revealed. Victoria hadn't just stolen money from my father. She'd potentially caused his death through deliberate negligence. That wasn't just theft or fraud. That was potentially manslaughter. But it was also information that would be almost impossible to prove in court. Text messages about his symptoms weren't enough to prove deliberate negligence. Phone records showing delayed medical calls could be explained as confusion or panic rather than calculation. Still, it was information that Victoria didn't know I had. Information that could be leveraged if she ever tried to cause problems for me or challenge the terms of our agreement. More importantly, it confirmed what I'd suspected for months, that my father's decision to leave me everything hadn't just been about rewarding my independence. It had been about protecting his legacy from people who'd proven they couldn't be trusted with it. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret Harrison. "Can you come by the office? Something's come up regarding the Thompson estate." As I changed direction toward Margaret's office, I wondered what new revelation awaited me. The past year had been full of surprises, each one reshaping my understanding of my family and my father's final plans. But whatever Margaret had to tell me, I was ready for it. I'd learned that I was stronger than I'd ever known, more capable than anyone had given me credit for, and more deserving of my father's trust than even I had realized. The black sheep of the Thompson family had become its shepherd, and I was determined to lead it somewhere better than where it had been. 1 year after my father's funeral, I stood once again in the offices of Harrison and Associates, but this time, everything was different. I wasn't the broken, struggling musician who'd been shocked by an unexpected inheritance. I was the CEO of a transformed corporation, a woman who'd proven that the Thompson name could stand for something more than just profit and power. Margaret Harrison was waiting for me with the same sharp smile she'd worn when she'd first revealed my father's master plan, but today there was something else in her expression. Satisfaction, pride, maybe even a hint of maternal approval. "Rachel," she said, standing to greet me. "You look well. CEO life agrees with you." "Thank you. Your message said something had come up regarding the estate?" "Indeed. Please sit down. This is complicated." I settled into the familiar leather chair, curious about what new twist my father's legacy might contain. Over the past year, I'd learned that Richard Thompson had been far more strategic in his final plans than anyone had realized. "Do you remember when I told you that your father had been planning his will changes for over a year?" "Of course. What I didn't tell you then was that he'd also been making other arrangements. Contingency plans, you might say, based on how well you handled your inheritance." Margaret pulled out a thick folder I'd never seen before. "Your father left specific instructions that if, after 1 year, you had proven yourself capable of managing his legacy responsibly, certain additional provisions of his estate would be activated." Additional provisions. "Rachel, your father didn't just leave you $35 million. He left you significantly more than that, but he wanted to make sure you'd use it wisely before you gained access to all of it." I stared at Margaret, trying to process what she was telling me. "How much more?" "Your father's total estate was worth approximately $120 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. 120 million? The 35 million you inherited was just the beginning. The company, the real estate holdings, the liquid assets he wanted you to have immediately. But he also had offshore investments, international properties, a private equity portfolio, and several trusts that he didn't want to burden you with until he was sure you could handle them responsibly." Margaret opened the folder and began spreading documents across her desk. "Over the past year, I've been monitoring your management of Thompson Development, your personal financial decisions, and your handling of the family situation. Your father left very specific criteria for determining whether you'd proven yourself worthy of the full inheritance." "What kind of criteria?" "First, that you would transform Thompson Development into a socially responsible company, rather than just maximizing profits. You've exceeded that expectation with the community development projects, the fair wage initiatives, and the environmental sustainability programs." I thought about the past year, the long hours spent restructuring the company, the careful hiring of ethical executives, the decision to prioritize long-term community impact over short-term financial gains. It had been challenging, sometimes frustrating, but ultimately more rewarding than anything I'd ever done. "Second, that you would handle the situation with Victoria, Marcus, and Sophia with justice but not cruelty. You could have had them arrested and imprisoned, but instead, you chose a path that held them accountable while giving them the opportunity to learn and change. Has it worked?" I asked, thinking about my conversation with Marcus and his apparent transformation. "Better than anyone expected. Marcus has become one of the most dedicated associates at his law firm. Apparently, actually having to earn his success has motivated him in ways that inherited wealth never did. Sophia has thrown herself into nonprofit work and discovered she has a genuine talent for grant writing and community outreach. Even Victoria has found purpose, volunteering at a women's shelter and using her social connections to raise funds for charitable causes. The irony wasn't lost on me. Losing their comfortable lives had forced all of them to discover who they actually were when they couldn't rely on Thompson money to define their worth. And third, Margaret continued, that you would use your personal wealth responsibly rather than just indulging in luxury. Your father was very specific about this. He wanted to see that money wouldn't corrupt you the way it had corrupted them. I thought about my choices over the past year. Yes, I'd moved out of that cheap motel and into a nice apartment, but nothing extravagant. Yes, I'd bought a reliable car, but nothing flashy. Most of my new wealth had gone into investments, charitable giving, and funding my music career properly. Not to buy fame, but to create the kind of music I'd always wanted to make, without worrying about paying rent. So what happens now? I asked. Now you gain access to everything. The offshore accounts, the international properties, the investment portfolios. But more than that, you gain access to your father's real legacy project. Margaret pulled out one final document, this one bound in leather with my father's initials embossed on the cover, the Thompson Foundation. Foundation? Your father spent the last 5 years of his life secretly planning the creation of one of the largest charitable foundations in the Midwest. He wanted to use the bulk of his wealth to address systemic poverty, fund education initiatives, and support community development projects across the region. I opened the leather-bound document and found myself looking at organizational charts, funding strategies, and program descriptions for a foundation that would have an endowment of over $80 million. He was planning to announce it before he died, Margaret explained, but his health declined faster than expected. So instead, he made you the sole trustee, with complete authority to implement his vision or modify it as you see fit. The magnitude of what my father had been planning took my breath away. He hadn't just been building a business empire. He'd been creating a mechanism for transforming entire communities, for addressing the kind of systemic inequalities that he'd contributed to during his earlier, more profit-focused years. Margaret, this is incredible. But why didn't he just tell me about it himself? Margaret's expression grew soft, almost maternal. Because he wanted to be sure you'd choose to do the right thing even when you thought no one was watching. He wanted to know that your integrity was genuine, not just a performance for his benefit. And if I had failed his tests, then the money would have gone to existing charities, and the foundation would never have been created. He would rather have seen his wealth dispersed to established organizations than risk it being misused by someone who wasn't ready for the responsibility. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the trust my father had placed in me and the magnitude of the responsibility I was about to inherit. How long do I have to decide whether to accept this? You don't have to decide, Rachel. Your actions over the past year have already decided for you. The foundation is yours, if you want it. As I drove back to the Thompson building that afternoon, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. A year ago, I'd been a struggling musician living paycheck to paycheck, estranged from my family, and convinced that I'd never amount to anything in their eyes. Now I was not just wealthy, but powerful in ways I'd never imagined. I had the resources to transform communities, to create opportunities for people who'd been written off the way I once was, to prove that money could be a force for good when it was used by people who understood its true value. But first, I had one more piece of business to attend to. That evening, I called Victoria, Marcus, and Sophia and asked them to meet me at my apartment. It was time for a final conversation, one that would determine what our relationship would be going forward. They arrived together, clearly having discussed strategy beforehand. But there was something different about all of them. A humility, a groundedness that hadn't been there a year ago when they'd been living off stolen money and inherited privilege. "Thank you all for coming," I said, gesturing for them to sit in my living room. "I have something I need to tell you." Victoria looked nervous. "Rachel, if this is about the restitution payments, we've been making them on time. This isn't about the restitution." I looked at each of them in turn. "This is about Dad, and about what he really left behind." Over the next hour, I told them about the foundation, about the additional wealth I'd just inherited, about the tests my father had designed to determine whether I was worthy of his trust. I told them about Margaret's reports on their progress over the past year, about how their forced return to normal life had actually helped them become better people. "I'm telling you this," I concluded, "because I want you to understand something. Dad didn't leave me everything because he loved me more than he loved you. He left me everything because he knew I would use it to create opportunities for people who needed them, including the three of you, if you wanted them." Marcus was the first to speak. "What do you mean?" "I mean that the Thompson Foundation is going to need dedicated staff members, people who understand what it's like to have privilege, to lose it, and to rebuild their lives from the ground up. People who've learned the difference between inherited worth and earned worth." I looked directly at each of them. There are positions available if you're interested. Real positions, with real responsibilities and real accountability, but also with the opportunity to be part of something meaningful. Sophia was crying again, but these were different tears than the ones she'd shed a year ago. You'd want us to work for you? I'd want you to work with me. There's a difference. Victoria was staring at me like she was seeing me for the first time. After everything we did to you, after what I did to Richard, you'd trust us with something this important? I thought about Marcus's confession regarding my father's death, about the negligence that had potentially shortened his life. I thought about the anger I'd carried, the desire for revenge that had motivated me through the darkest moments of the past year. I'd trust you to earn that trust, I said finally, the same way I had to earn Dad's trust, even after he was gone. We talked for another 2 hours that night, about the Foundation's mission, about the roles they might play, about what it would mean to dedicate their lives to something larger than themselves. By the time they left, we'd laid the groundwork for a partnership that would have been unimaginable a year ago. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of the newly opened Thompson Foundation headquarters, watching Victoria coordinate a housing initiative for homeless veterans, Marcus review legal documents for a community development project, and Sophia organize a fundraising gala that would support educational programs in underserved neighborhoods. They were working harder than they'd ever worked in their lives, earning modest salaries that were a fraction of what they'd once taken for granted. But there was something in their faces that I'd never seen before. Purpose, satisfaction, the quiet pride that comes from knowing you've contributed something valuable to the world. The foundation had already approved grants totaling $20 million in its first 6 months of operation. We were funding after-school programs, job training initiatives, small business loans, and community health clinics. We were proving that wealth could be a tool for building up, rather than just accumulating more. My father's funeral had been the beginning of the most difficult year of my life, but it had also been the beginning of the most meaningful year of my life. I'd learned that being underestimated was actually an advantage, that struggling to earn what you have makes you appreciate it more, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the opportunity to prove they're better than they thought they were. As I watched my former tormentors work alongside dedicated community organizers and social workers, I realized that my father's final plan had been even more brilliant than I'd originally understood. He hadn't just given me the resources to build a better life for myself. He'd given me the opportunity to build better lives for everyone, including the family members who'd once seen me as nothing more than a disappointment. If this story inspired you, make sure to subscribe for more incredible stories of justice and redemption. Remember, sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's giving them the chance to become the people they were always capable of being. And sometimes the black sheep of the family turns out to be exactly the shepherd that family needed all along.